It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. And well, it is the 200th Monster Mondays episode. Welcome back, and I think if you listened to last week's episode on F.W. Murnau's Faust from 1926, you could probably piece it together that I was going to do two Murnau films back to back, and you already knew one of the most important horror films to ever be filmed would end up becoming the 200th episode of this show. And yes, it's Nosferatu. Nosferatu began life as an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Stoker's novel was written 25 years earlier, so yeah, not only is Nosferatu celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, the original text is a nice round 125 years old as well. Now, Stoker's heirs were very much against the film being made. It is important to note that while the book is now in the public domain, back then, the Stoker family still hoarded the rights to the use of the characters and the story. And despite substantial differences being made by screenwriter Henrik Galeen, the Stokers sued, and the order was made to destroy the film completely. However, some prints escaped and made its way to other parts of the world. And from there, Nosferatu would be one of the most influential pieces of cinema ever created. While the use of set, shadows, makeup, etc. would all be something that would be utilized by all genres, I can't even begin to imagine what the horror genre would have become without this movie. Would the Universal classics we've covered so many of on this show even be able to live as long and be as well received as they were without being able to potentially look at this movie and see how it was shot? I don't know the answer to that. However, I do know that Nosferatu is the template for how to make a truly unsettling movie about a terrible monster. Now, we just covered the 1979 remake on Film Seizure that was made by Werner Herzog about a week and a half ago. While this movie obviously sets a visual stage for how a horror movie can be made and what it could mean to cinema as a whole, the remake gives us something else that this movie really kind of couldn't and wouldn't. And the vampire of Herzog's film is almost sympathetic. He's this lonely, isolated creature that is actually trying to find death just as much as he wants to feel love just once in his miserable existence. Now, the 1922 version and the 1979 remake are almost perfect mirror images of each other, with both exploring different sides of our version of Dracula here. But Nosferatu is a very different telling of Dracula. Yes, of course, our vampire character is renamed to Count Orlok. There are important characters who are either completely removed or changed to the point of hardly being recognizable. And yeah, there's the romantic angle that would be like your Jonathan and Mina from the classic text. But there's no real Van Helsing type who comes in, knows right away that Orlok what he is and knows what to do with him. But in its essential story and what is being drawn from Stoker's text, this is the first real telling of Dracula on the big screen. Before we come back around to Nosferatu, let's finish talking about director F.W. Murnau. Now, Murnau, as I said last week, had a third famous movie. There was Nosferatu and Faust, yes, but there was also Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans in 1927. That was his first American film made for Fox Film Corporation. It is considered today to be one of the greatest films ever made, and it won 3 Oscars at the first ever Academy Awards. It won for Best Cinematography. Janet Gaynor won the first Best Actress award, and while back then an actor would receive the Oscar for an entire body of work in the date range the ceremony was for, she was in Sunrise, so that counted. But it also won an award called Best Unique and Artistic Picture. This award was only ever given out at the very first ceremony. It was at the time considered as prestigious as Outstanding Picture, which we know today as Best Picture, but later on it was considered that while, yeah, sure, Sunrise was the best unique or artistic picture, whatever that actually means, the winner of Outstanding Picture, Wings, was really the higher honor and went down as the only movie mentioned when looking at the list of Oscar's Best Picture category. Now, Murnau wouldn't make many films in America. Sadly, in March of 1931, he was driving along the Pacific Coast Highway with his valet and rumored lover, and they swerved to avoid a truck that unexpectedly veered into their lane and struck an embankment. The car was overturned, and Murnau suffered a massive head injury and died the next day in the hospital. He was given a service in Hollywood before his body was sent back to Germany to be entombed. There, fellow German filmmaker Fritz Lang delivered the eulogy. And aside from Murnau, the other major figure in Nosferatu easily is Max Schreck. Schreck is immortalized as Orlok for his slender stature and seemingly impossibly long arms and legs. He was a pretty private guy outside of being in the movies. He was pretty well known for playing grotesque characters, and a friend and contemporary of the actor said that he lived in a remote and incorporeal world. I mean, can you do anything more to try to make this guy sound like a ghost or a ghoul? Oh, and he did also like spending time wandering through forests. So could you imagine running into Max Schreck in a forest when you didn't expect to run into anyone else? Jesus. But there were rumors around the time of the release of this film that he wasn't actually a real person, but that the name Max Schreck was a pseudonym of another actor of the time, Alfred Abel. Maybe one of the earliest Hollywood Babylon type of story was for this mysterious actor playing this incredible monster. Now, one last thing I do want to bring up about Nosferatu before we dig into this movie is that there was a strong theme of the fear of the quote-unquote other. It also has some reference to possible anti-Semitic undertones, but it's also understood that both of these things may have actually come from Stoker's text more than any intent by Murnau or Galeen. Clearly, the rodent features of Orlok, his hooked nose and claw-like fingernails, were definitely something that was common in portrayals of Jewish people in cartoons and caricatures of the time. Plus, Orlok's going out and buying up land in Germany and immigrating there from Transylvania also played to a lot of fears of outsiders invading Northern European countries at the time. The death that Orlok brings is seen as a disease, which was also a lot of fears about Jewish folks that they carried diseases to infect others with. All these things are kind of easily to look at from a macro level, looking at it through the lens of history. However, it's also often dismissed as something conscious to do because Murnau, being a gay man himself, would likely have had a ton of sensitivity about othering another subgroup of people. So while some people could very easily draw these parallels, it is very likely nothing here that was fully intended by the filmmakers. So this movie opens up in 1838, and the film tells us that it will recount the Great Death that came to Wiesborg in northern Germany. We are introduced to a man named Hutter and his young wife Ellen. The young couple are very much in love and seemingly happy. However, when Hutter brings Ellen some flowers that he picked in the garden, she seems almost sad, asking why he would kill such beautiful things. Hutter works for a man named Knock. Now, Knock was a very strange man, and rumors circulated about this fella who, if we're being honest, simply looks bizarre. However, to work for Knock is to be paid well by Knock, and he tells Hutter that he is to go to Count Orlok in Transylvania and sell him a house in Wiesborg. This will not be easy. It may require some sweat and a little blood. In actuality, Nock wants Hutter to sell Orlok the house right across the street from his, so he'll make good money, but it's now time for Hutter to be off to the, quote, land of phantoms. And Ellen is not as pleased as Hutter is about this assignment. But Hutter makes the weeks-long journey to the Carpathian Mountains, where the villagers at the foot of the mountains welcome Hutter happily. Their hospitality starts to run out when he talks about where he has business. In fact, they are emphatic that he is not to go to Count Orlok's castle. They tell him that he can't go tonight because there's a werewolf roaming the forest, and he must remain there at the inn. And yes, indeed, we do see that there is a wolf creature on the prowl. And Hutter does remain in the village for the night and is given a room at the inn. And on the nightstand, Hutter finds a book about vampires and other supernatural things. And it tells of how the Nosferatu was born directly from the devil himself and brings with him the Black Plague. Now, Hutter dismisses the book as silly, laughs it off, and tosses it aside. Come morning, Hutter is still laughing at the superstitions in the book, and he gathers his things up and is seen off by a carriage where he will continue into the mountains and hopefully on to Count Orlok's castle. However, the driver stops the carriage well short of the destination, and he says that he refuses to go into the Borgo Pass no matter what Hutter pays him. Undeterred by their ominous feelings, he continues on foot. That night, Hutter is picked up by a mysterious carriage driven by someone dressed in all black. The man drives fast and wild through the night and through the forest, but delivers Hutter to the castle of Count Orlok. The skinny count meets Hutter at the door and tells him that he's been waiting too long for him, and now that it is nearly midnight, all the servants are asleep. But Hutter is led into the castle, where he is given a small dinner, and Orlok reads over the deed that is prepared for him. One thing I want to say that I've never noticed before, or I never really thought about before, is that the deed that's written up is entirely made from what looks like almost hieroglyphs. There's a combination of symbology in there as well as actual pictures of things. And we saw that earlier as Nock was reading through it, but here it's just a very weird document. And I don't know if that was made just to kind of have something on the paper and not really have any kind of language attached to it or what, but it is, it's almost spooky in its own right, just because the totally alien language. So that I find very interesting. But Hutter accidentally cuts himself with the dinner knife, and Orlok is immediately drawn to the blood and sucks it off of Hutter's finger. Hutter backs away from his host in fear, and Orlok bids Hutter to stay a little longer, and Orlok tells his guest that he sleeps by day and is completely dead to the world. The next morning, Hutter wakes up alone but finds two small wounds on his neck that he just thinks came from mosquitoes. Later that night, Orlok signs the deeds for the sale of the house, and Orlok sees a picture of Ellen and comments about how lovely her neck is. Hutter is a little concerned about both that comment and the fact that he will soon be living across the street from this weird man. Later, Hutter finds that book from the inn about vampires and other monsters and so forth, and he begins to suspect that his host may indeed be a vampire. And at midnight, he looks out his bedroom door to see the Count standing ghoulishly at the end of the hallway. Seeing no way to escape or protect himself, he's helpless to watch the vampiric Count open the door pretty much with his mind and enter. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Ellen simultaneously begins sleepwalking, and as Hutter is attacked by Orlok in Transylvania, Ellen shouts his name. The next morning, Hutter finds Orlok sleeping in a coffin. That night, Hutter witnesses the Count loading the coffins onto a wagon to be carried upstream by raftsmen who will then deliver the cargo to a ship that will set sail for Wiesborg. All the members of the crew of the ship knew was that they were carrying 6 boxes of quote-unquote experimental dirt. But meanwhile, Hutter is taken to a hospital to be treated for a fever, and he keeps shouting something about these coffins. In Wiesborg, Nock has begun to act strange. While Hutter was gone, he was placed in an asylum and is starting to act up more and more as the Nosferatu got closer and closer to the village. Nock just shouts about how blood is life and catches flies and eats them. As Nock continues to act like a total weirdo, we meet Professor Bolver, who is a physician and has some curiosity about carnivorous biology of some plants and animals. He seems to always be on the fringes of wanting to understand more of the world's curiosities. Now, interestingly, while this guy is maybe set up to be a Van Helsing-like character, he's totally not a player of any kind, really, in this movie, and that's just kind of an aside. Really, the next significant time you see him really is at the end of the movie. But on the ship carrying Orlok's boxes, crew members are starting to fall ill unexpectedly, and as the crew begins to investigate what's going on with these boxes, Orlok awakens and the rest of the crew is killed. There's a really cool title card that says, "The Death Ship has a new captain," and it's really kind of chillingly perfect. While the ship drifts towards Wiesberg, Hutter is trying to beat the ship home by way of horse and his own 2 feet. The two travelers basically arrive back at Wiesberg at the same time. The next morning, the authorities investigate the death ship and find that the slain captain tied to the wheel. And as the town council goes through the logs, they read of the possibility of plague, and everyone is to return home and bolt all the doors and remain as safe as possible. This does not work. The town is stricken heavily by the sudden outbreak of the Black Plague. Despite Hutter telling her not to, Ellen begins reading the book about vampires and learns that an innocent maiden can make the vampire miss the first crowing of the cock in the morning. This will make the vampire susceptible to the sun, which will kill him. In fact, it is said that it is the only way to get rid of this curse. Ellen reveals to Hutter that across the way she sees every night a weird man looking out the window at their home. And of course, Hutter knows that it is Orlok that she is seeing. The town, still in the throes of hysteria over the plague, decide that they must have a scapegoat for all of this, and they choose Nock. Now, he's out of the asylum and being chased by the surviving villagers. Later that night, Ellen opens her window to essentially invite Orlok to her bedchamber, even though she knows that this will mean her own death. But Orlok immediately picks up on her signals and begins to head across the street to her. Now, Ellen tells Hutter to go fetch Bolver, so he is not home when Orlok comes for her. Orlok comes into Ellen's room and feeds on her until the morning. He does not leave before the sun rises and fades away in a small pile of smoke. Nock, returned to his cell, declares that the master has died. Ellen has the opportunity to see Hutter one last time before she, too, dies. Alright, so for the 200th time, let's get to the 3 things that I like about Nosferatu. First, the pacing of this movie is perfect. The other 4 movies of this month had moments in which you could say things could be trimmed or the pacing should be sped up to keep the films moving a little bit more briskly, but not here. This movie flies by, but it's not moving too fast for you either. This is like being thrust into this nightmare that the movie is portraying. One of the great things about the 2 most important versions of this film is how they both handle pacing. Both move at a really nice pace, but while this one thrusts you into the insanity that comes with the story, the 1979 Herzog version lulls you into this nightmare. But both are handling the story and the things that will happen to the characters perfectly. Here, you suddenly realize that you're already 30 minutes in, and before you realize it, you quickly see that you've made it to the 60-minute mark without even watching the time pass. It's a relatively exhilarating 90 minutes. My second second like about this is how acts 3 and 4 of this movie, basically the midsection of this movie, nearly turns into this action movie where a race takes place. Hutter is cutting through the continent of Europe while Orlok's death ship is sailing around it. In the latest remastering of the movie, even the music picks up to almost sound like an action movie score. There are quicker and quicker back and forth cuts of the ship and the desperate Hutter traveling by foot and by carriage and by any other means possible to return home to save his love and his hometown. It kind of plays to that first, like that pacing, but in this portion of the movie, it is just exciting. It's an exciting sequence. Now, thirdly, it's impossible to watch this movie without recognizing the amazing cinematography and photographic work of Count Orlok in particular. There is no less than 5 cinematically unforgettable shots in this movie. The first is when Hutter begins to suspect that Orlok is the Nosferatu, and the door opens and Orlok slowly creeps into his room with the door frame perfectly cut to his form and in his appearance as the Count slowly closing in on his prey. Second, on board the death ship, when the first mate is hacking open the coffins, we see that horrific shot of Orlok's coffin getting essentially blown open and him rising out of it almost like he's levitating himself to his feet. Thirdly, right after that, we see the incredibly memorable shot of Orlok on the deck of the death ship beginning to stalk his final victim, the captain. Next, the one shot almost anyone who spends any time looking at memorable camera work knows, and that's Orlok ascending the stairs as he creeps towards the room of Ellen's, where she plans to set the ruse into motion. His smooth movements up the stairs, almost like he's gliding or floating up the stairs with a single outreached hand, is stuff of nightmare and also of cinematic legend. Finally, as the sun rises and Orlok has fed, him rising from Ellen's neck to realize that he is late to escape the sun is a scene that you'll see in a lot of images from, almost as much as him going up the stairs to her. The cinematography for this movie was mostly handled by Fritz Arno Wagner, but Gunther Krampf also did some uncredited work. Whoever did what, they filmed a timeless masterpiece. And before I wrap up this episode, I do want to give this quote from Roger Ebert about Nosferatu because I think it is right on the nose. And this was from 1997 when he added Nosferatu to his list of the great movies, which he curated and published in a trio of books as a kind of guide for someone to be able to see the best that cinema ever had to offer. And he wrote, quote, "Here is the story of Dracula before it was buried alive in cliches, jokes, TV skits, cartoons, and more than 30 other films. The film is in awe of its material. It seems to really believe in vampires. Is Murnau's Nosferatu scary in the modern sense? Not for me. I admire it more for its artistry and ideas, its atmosphere and images, than for its ability to manipulate my emotions like a skillful modern horror film. It knows none of the later tricks of the trade, like the sudden threats that pop in from the side of the screen. But Nosferatu remains effective. It doesn't scare us, but it haunts us." Unquote. And I think that pretty much sums up the effectiveness of this 100-year-old classic. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at FilmSeizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, I return to the world of Doctor Who for yet another vampire tale. Yeah, there was a time in which the fourth Doctor found himself up against a trio of vampires in the 1980 serial State of Decay. So until next week, stay spooky.